Good evening. My name is James Zimmerman, Senior Public Programs Producer here at the National Museum of American History. And on behalf of the museum and with our partner, Washington National Opera, I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight as we explore the legacy of America's most celebrated opera, Porgy and Bess. And I'm quite happy also that we didn't get the snow that was predicted. When you arrived, and as you sat here waiting for the program to begin, you may have noticed that the various interpretations, jazz and popular song renderings of songs from Porgy and Bess by some of America's beloved jazz artists. These recordings are a testament to the influential and inspirational power of George Gershwin's compositions. Part of the mission of the National Museum of American History is to inspire a broader understanding of our nation and its many people, and to create learning opportunities, stimulate imaginations, and present challenging ideas about our country's past. The history and legacy of Porgy and Bess is a great vehicle to do just that. To take us on this journey, please welcome my colleagues, Dwight Blocker Bowers, curator of American music in the area of music, sports, and entertainment, and Fath Davis Ruffins, curator of African American music and culture. After making a presentation, they will introduce our honored colleagues and partners from Washington National Opera. Dwight?
I promise to have you out of here by midnight.
Oh my.
It works. Porgy and Bess begins its odyssey in a novel called Porgy by Arthur DuBose Hayward. A South Carolinian by birth, he had grown up around the Gullah people indigenous to the region of Charleston. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Fath Ruffins.
Let's see here. He handed it to me, but he didn't tell me which way it worked.
The right.
This is to just give you a sense of the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The rice coast. Rice was the most important crop. And the Gullah people and the Geechee people, who are sometimes called, they're the same ethnic group, but they are in Georgia, they're often known as the Geechee. In Carolina, they're often known as the Gullah people, lived on the coastal lands and on the sea islands. The most famous sea island today is probably Hilton Head, but there are many, many islands, coastal islands, and these people have a very particular history, the tales of which I cannot go into now. But one of the most important things for a musical understanding is that the Gullah people who live in and around Charleston are some of the most documented African Americans in this country, and their music in particular, their songs, their stories, their legends, their music are among the most documented. The first spirituals that were ever written down in 1866 and 1867 were taken from the Gullah people in the Sea Islands. Wanted to give you a few images of Charleston. Charleston, South Carolina, of course, is one of the cities of the Old South. It became a tourist destination in the 1890s and has remained a tourist destination to the present day. Here you see a very important landmark, the Central Market in Charleston, in a historic shot and in a contemporary shot, which I tried to give you some sense of, we tend to think of the past as being black and white because we see lots of black and white photographs. But of course the past was in color, just like the present is in color. So I thought I would give you a historical feel, but also show you something of what these enormous old houses in Charleston look like. And Du Bois Hayward, who was the scion of several very wealthy planter families before the Civil War, but who lived he was born after the Civil War. His mother was born, is in the generation that lived, was a child during the war, and their land and their holdings were, of course, decimated. This is a view, that's a wonderful postcard from the 40s of the Battery, The Battery is where many of these houses face the ocean in Charleston. And to give you the atmospheric view of the time when Gershwin goes down to visit Du Bois Hayward in order to work on the production of what becomes Porgy and Bess, the old oaks with the moss. This is a photograph by Doris Ullman from the 30s. This is also Bayard Wooten, another photographer who documents the African Americans of the time. These are from the 30s. The street criers of Charleston, some of their street cries appear in the productions, and you see a South Carolina vegetable woman, the sounds of people calling out, selling fish, selling vegetables, and the baskets, the woven baskets, which now are very characteristic element when you go to Charleston, are all evocative of this rich African American culture of the time. This is another Doris Ullman photograph from the 30s of a river baptism. There are a number of songs, religious songs, that are the basis for some of the music in Porgy and Bess. These are images of Cabbage, quote unquote, Cabbage Row, or sometimes known as Catfish Row. The setting that Du Bois Hayward chose was of a series of tenements, and although they don't look like tenements today, these are the houses on the left that were this place where he set Porgy and Bess. Those houses had been built for freedmen and for soldiers who were, after the Civil War, who were in Charleston, African American soldiers. And they were, of course, run down at the time that he set the setting there. If you go to Charleston today and take a Gullah tour, they will show you this place on the right as, quote unquote, Cabbage Row. This is a wonderful Marion Post Alcott, famous Farm Services photographer, Farm Security Administration photographer from the 1930s, from the New Deal. This is a July 4th celebration, and if you know the story of Porgy and Bess, you know they go on a picnic. And this is a July 4th picnic on St. Helena's Island in the 30s. Very few images from the FSA photographs are in color, but these are two of this same picnic. So we just wanted to give you a sense of what that culture was like.
Well, the novel Porgy went on to become a bestseller, counting among its many fans a composer named George Gershwin, who found it an ideal source material for an opera that he longed to write. By 1926, Gershwin had become a major voice in the American musical theater, and he found a strong sense of kinship with music of African Americans. Often with his brother Ira, and not as many critics and Johnny Carson once referred to him as his lovely wife Ira. With him, he wrote a number of great songs for great performers of the era, such as Al Jolson and Fred and Adele Astaire. And these were songs like Swanee and Fascinating Rhythm and Lady Be Good. And in 1922, George Gershwin wrote, with lyricist B.G. De Silva, an extended musical sequence called Blue Monday for the Broadway review George White's Scandals. And this was described as a jazz opera, and it's often thought as a precursor of Porgy and Bess because it has an African-American milieu. It's set in Harlem in a saloon, and it uses a lot of jazz, and it's through song. Blue Monday, which was performed by white actors in blackface, met with mixed critical response from both the audiences that viewed it as well as the one or two critics that wrote about it, and was removed from the show after only one performance. Although one critic pronounced it the first gleam of a new American musical art. Gershwin had also forged a parallel compositional path into the world of concert music with his 1924 symphonic work, Rhapsody in Blue. In 1926, Gershwin approached DuBose Hayward about adapting the novel Porgy as an opera. Hayward was thrilled, but said the adaptation would have to wait, primarily because his wife, Dorothy, had written a dramatic version of the novel called Porgy. And transforming this novel into a dramatic play was met by great success. And there is the production from 1927. Not unlike the images we've seen also of the opera, as well as a copy of the copyright for the script. So the adaptation was postponed until late 1933. In the interim, Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, who wrote the monumental Showboat, expressed interest in adapting Porgy, the novel, into a musical for Al Jolson. And I think we're all happy that it didn't happen. In the summer of 1934, Gershwin and Hayward met in South Carolina, and George took up residency at Folly Beach, a small island that's located near Charleston. And it immersed him in the culture and the locale of the era, and he soaked up what he saw and he heard and transmuted it into music and the atmosphere of the opera. Soon, Ira Gershwin agreed to join the team as co-lyricist. In October of 1935, Porgy and Bess premiered on Broadway. And imagine an opera having a presence on Broadway at this time period. But of course, Broadway has often been visited since by operas, and this was an important effort for that. The Broadway opening, with Washingtonian Todd Duncan as Porgy and soprano Anne Brown as Bess, was met with mixed critical response. In fact, composers Duke Ellington and Virgil Thomson were critical of the work, finding the music inauthentic to the African-American milieu. And the original production endured for only 124 performances, rendering it a commercial failure. Following the Broadway production, the opera went on tour, ending its run right here in Washington, D.C. In 1942, Broadway saw a return of the opera, again with the leads, Brown and Duncan, and the show had many changes at this point. The opera had many changes because the sung dialogue, or recitative, was turned into spoken dialogue, and they downsized the orchestra, and they downsized the chorus, and it became sort of like a musical, or a musical drama. The work was later excerpted in the 1945 Warner Brothers film Rhapsody in Blue. This purported to be a biography of George Gershwin. I think it dealt with the truth with every other frame of the film. In the early 1950s, Porgy and Bess traveled across the globe in a State Department-sponsored tour starring none other than William Warfield and Leontine Price. This led eventually to a 1959 Hollywood film version, which starred Sidney Poitier and Dorothy Dandridge. Also beginning in the late 1950s, a number of pop and jazz artists sort of mined this score for musical moments that they could turn into material for their own repertoire. Interest was revived in the opera itself in 1976 with a heralded production by the Houston Grand Opera. And in 1985, the 50th anniversary of the show's premiere on Broadway, it was presented by the Metropolitan Opera in a production with Grace Bumbry. And that leads us to another milestone in the history of Porgy and Bess, and that is the production by Washington National Opera, the new production that will be presented this season. So we're going to have a lighting change, and we'll soon be joined by the rest of our panel. Thank you.
I can't sit next to you. You're going to make me laugh.
We are delighted and honored to have with us principals from Washington National Opera's production of Porgy and Bess. I'm going to read the names of our participants, and they will afterwards take the stage. The conductor, Maestro John Mauceri, is Chancellor of the University of North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Former music director of the Washington Opera, as well as a former consultant for music theater at the Kennedy Center during Roger Stevens' tenure. He has also served as music director for 3 other opera companies in Glasgow, Turin, Italy, and Pittsburgh. He is the first American to have held the position or post of music director of an opera house in either Great Britain or Italy. Among his many awards and honors are a Grammy, a Tony, Olivier, and 2 Emmys. Please welcome or acknowledge John Mauceri. The Associate Director, Rita Tikador, she assisted Francesca Zambello on the original Washington National Opera production of Porgy and Bess in fall of 2005 and its subsequent appearances at Los Angeles Opera and Lyric Opera of Chicago. She is a veteran of over 200 performances of Porgy and Bess throughout Europe, and she currently serves as a production stage manager for both Orlando Opera and Disney Creative Entertainment. Please welcome Rita Tikador.
Thank you.
In the role of Porgy, we have Eric Owens. A native of Philadelphia, Owens began his music training as a pianist at the age of 6 and later studied voice while an undergraduate at Temple University and then as a graduate student at the Curtis Institute of Music. Owens has been recognized with multiple awards, including the 2003 Marian Anderson Award, a 1999 ARIA Award, and first prize in the Placido Domingo Opera Competition, the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions, and the Luciano Pavarotti International Voice Competition. Please welcome Eric Owens. In the role of Bess, we have Morenike Fadayoni. What a beautiful name. She was born in London, raised in England, Africa, and Switzerland. She studied dance at the Colombo Dance Factory, specializing in ballet, jazz, modern acting, and musicals. And I have to tell you, I cannot butcher this German name, so I will not try. Please welcome Morenike Fadayoni. In the role of Sporting Life, Jermaine Smith. He attended the New England Conservatory of Music and is on the voice faculty at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Smith's wide range of operatic roles include Figaro and Junius in The Rape of Lucretia. His extensive work with Porgy and Bess has taken him to Japan, Germany, Sweden, Austria, Netherlands, Italy, and many other places. Please welcome. You've been all over.
All right.
Jermaine Smith. Our accompanist tonight is Michael Baitzer. Michael, please join us.
I'd like to start with a question for the maestro. I'd like to know what prompted you to return to and reconstruct the original 1935 performance in the score?
Well, if we were hello, good evening, everybody. One of the things that makes Porgy and Bess so complicated is that in the original production in 1935, which you just saw a little glimpse of, George Gershwin worked on that opera very, very steadfastly. He was famous for overwriting. For example, An American in Paris is 10 minutes longer than the version we all know. He wrote more than he needed. And then when he saw it, he would cut back to balance things because he needed that two-part process. And let's remember, Porgy and Bess actually is his first opera, even if 125th Street is an early attempt. And so he published privately the gigantic score of Porgy and Bess, which lasts close to 4 hours of music. And he described it while he was writing it to the public, that it was a cross between Die Meistersinger and Carmen. And a lot of people thought, well, that sounds like Abbott and Costello meets the Wolfman, and so what was that going to be? And it turns out that it is and was a gigantic opera. When it opened at the Alvin Theater, and don't confuse that with it being a Broadway musical, it was absolutely an opera, but just in a theater that was appropriate for the size. The work had been mostly changed in many ways. And that production, which ran 124 performances and then toured a little bit and closed in Washington, ended as a commercial failure. George Gershwin unfortunately died a year and a half later in Los Angeles. The reviews were bad for Porgy and Bess. He had been basically told that he had no business writing an opera. He had been told by the Broadway people that he'd probably lost the common touch because now he was writing an opera. And so he and his brother Ira moved to Los Angeles to, quote, repair their fortunes. Remember, during the time he was writing Porgy and Bess, he had no income whatsoever. And in fact, you may find on Amazon.com a radio show where George Gershwin was the narrator. It was called something like Adventures in Modern Music. And it was the commercial, the sponsor was Phenament, the chewing laxative. Yes. And hearing yes. George Gershwin promote the joys of Phenament is one of the more, a sad story about a composer trying to make a living. In any case, he died 2 years later, and Porgy and Bess, although some of the tunes were becoming popular, was basically a dead issue. And that was until 1941. And when Cheryl Crawford produced it on Broadway, she got rid of all of the material between the songs, and it was produced basically as a Broadway musical. That version was hugely successful, and that started the complication of whether Porgy and Bess is an opera or whether it's a musical. So in the 70s, when Ira Gershwin, who way outlived his brother and loved his brother so much and felt his brother never had the proper respect from the classical music community, his brother, Ira, published the full score, and Houston presented it, and Lauren Mazel recorded it, and Jimmy Levine did it at the Met. What they thought they were doing was the complete version of Porgy and Bess, the version that Gershwin had in his mind. Whereas in point of fact, it was about 40% more Porgy and Bess than he ever wanted on the stage once he saw it. So in order to restore it, it had to do with my desire to respect the composer, to treat George Gershwin the way we treat Mozart or Verdi or Wagner or any great composer. And as it turns out, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but as it turns out, because the show closed, the opera version closed, and those musical parts were never used again, we actually have, unlike many old operas, a set of orchestral parts and a conductor score and a stage manager score, all of which represent exactly what George Gershwin did in 1935, even though those changes were never published. So by simply going to the Beinecke Rare Book Museum at Library at Yale and spending a number of days there with Wayne Shirley, who used to, as many of you know, headed the music division at the Library of Congress and is arguably the greatest expert on Gershwin, we were able to restore the version that George Gershwin approved in 1935, and we were able to record it for Decca. And not only is it the actual text, but because we have the trombone part and the percussion part and the second violin part. We actually know how the conductor conducted it, because musicians write little, four slashes, a little apostrophe, a crescendo, eyeglasses, and so we can actually reconstruct the way it was performed. So that's why I did it, because it is a masterpiece, and it seemed it deserved the same attention we would give, say, A Marriage of Figaro or La Bohème.
Wonderful.
Well, it'd be wonderful for you to talk a little bit about why you decided to set it in the milieu of the 50s for this particular production.
Right. Well, you saw a photo quickly of our set, which represents an old fishing cannery, an old tenement of the 1950s. This is Francesca Zambella's production. She sat down with Peter J. Davison, who is the scenic designer, and they came up with the 1950s because they felt the 1950s was a little bit more visually stark and had more of a visual edge, and it was more based in reality to the people who would come and see the show today, as opposed to the 1920s and the 1930s. And the history of the 50s is still very much with us today. And that history is where we based Catfish Row. So Catfish Row for us is based in 1955, which is 2 years after the Korean War. So the Korean War has ended in 1953. Porgy comes home, a wounded veteran from the Korean War. He has a crutch instead of a cart. He does not have the use of his right leg, which is where his crutch comes in. So we have that going on. We also have Rosa Parks in 1954. We have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which of course sparks the civil rights movement in 1955. And Francesca really believed that was such a strong time, and it said so much to us, and really that reality is still with us today. And because of that, she felt that this piece would appeal to a lot more people if they understood where it was coming from. So that's why she chose the 1950s, which takes us to the set, which is an old tenement housing, an old, the projects, a tenement, whatever you call it in your neighborhood. That's what that is, which was actually very difficult for me when I first saw it. I thought, what is this? This is not Catfish Row at all. And then when I saw what we were doing with it and how Catfish Row came alive in the projects, in the tenements, and how when the scrim goes out at the top of the show, you're basically cutting in half this courtyard and everybody comes alive, it made absolute sense. And the important part for her about the 1950s and about this tenement was for it to feel claustrophobic. So you will read in her notes that this set this tenement is their fortress, but it's also their prison. Some of them wish to get out, some of them wish to stay, and you will see that throughout the entire production. And that's why she said it in the 1950s.
I'd like to get back to this ongoing misconception of Porgy and Bess as a musical. And I'd like to talk about the variety of music that's within the score, both arias and arioso numbers, as well as what feel like Broadway pieces. And how do you feel that it goes together? All of you who perform it nightly.
Maybe one of the singers would like to horn in. I answer the question.
Yes.
You veterans have a good. Yeah.
Well, all of you sing opera. Everyone here sings what we would all in this room think of, whether it's Verdi or Mozart. What makes it different then for you when you do these roles? Nothing, see?
For me, it's different in some of my approaches vocally because of the folk music aspect of it. I don't feel like I sing I Got Plenty of Nuttin', for example, like I would sing an aria. I'm just sort of, even though it has to be in, my technique is the same, but the way it feels almost, I almost said it feels more musical theater, but you know what I mean? But my approach to it is a little more just, folkish instead of something, even though it is an opera. I mean, and we have elements of that in many different operas. I mean, there's folk music in Verdi, there's folk music in Wagner,
Right.
So, when the folk music comes around, it's more earthy to me. It's a little more relaxed. There's a little more of a generosity of spirit and
But do you feel as an American, having grown up with this music, your connection with it is more direct?
absolutely, there's an immediacy there that one doesn't necessarily get with Verdi or Wagner, which I love singing, but I didn't, grow up, in Italy or Germany, and as an actor, when there's that immediacy, there's a level of comfort on the stage that even though you can learn a Verdi, Mozart opera backwards and forwards, but I never really feel like if the music stopped and we had to all just keep improvising as characters, I would know what that meant as just a culture. But here, if the music stopped and they like keep on going, we do it anyway. In rehearsals, we improvise a lot, and when the music stops, we keep on chatting in character, and I think that makes a difference. I've always said when I do sing Verdi and Wagner, I'm really jealous of the Italians or Germans who grew up with this and they could just sort of, it's in their blood. I mean, even though I think I do it quite well, but there's a certain disconnect.
Well, much of this music we encounter first as pop, and we need to remember that it's part of musical scenes. And I'm wondering if we could hear an example of a musical scene.
Well, what a clever introduction. When we found out we were going to be singing for you tonight, which was, I think, yesterday, and you have to remember, although everyone on the stage has done Porgy and Bess many times, we only all met as this company on Monday. And so on Monday, we had 6 hours of music rehearsal, 3 with the soloist and then 3 with the soloist and the chorus, and then we began with Rita staging it. And so there was a little challenge there. So we thought that instead of singing you hit tunes, which just underscores the idea that Porgy is a musical, because there are actual hit tunes, but then again in Rigoletto, Verdi knew very well that he was writing a hit tune with La Donna Mobile, and when he wrote a hit tune, for example, he frequently didn't allow the singers to sing it during the late rehearsals because he knew that the stagehands and everyone would be singing it, whistling it all over town in order to hold back. So every composer knew when he had a hit in his mind, and Gershwin certainly knew that with, for example, Summertime, which he uses 4 times in the opera. So we thought it would be good to give you an 8 or a 9-minute chunk of Porgy and Bess to show you how George Gershwin, this is, I think, the hardest thing. He's a songwriter. One of the reasons that critics were so snooty about him was because it's one thing to write a song, but if you think that's easy, just go out and try one. On the other hand, to write a fully composed opera. Now, let me just explain this, and this is really important. The basic idea of composing this opera was that when you are in Catfish Row, which is a total community, a community which has many good people, some bad people, people who are religious, people who are sacrilegious, people who are old, who are young. It is a total community, just like, say, Cavalleria Rusticana takes place in a community. But when the white people enter this community, the music stops. And that is a brilliant stroke, because the white people do not have the soul, do not have the rhythm, do not have the harmony. Once the white people leave, the music starts again. And that's one of the reasons why the musical comedy version of it undermines the very basic compositional structure that Gershwin set. So we thought we would do a little scene with Sport and Life, and Bess, and then when Porgy shows his enormous strength. Remember, when this opera was conceived, Porgy was on his knees on a little wagon. So he was really half the size of everybody. And so the idea that he is enormously strong happens in this scene, where he actually comes to the rescue of Bess because of Sport and Life, who always wants to give anybody in town, sell those people drugs. In that story is not a black story or a white story, it's a world story. And just as Rita said, so much of what this opera is about things that we deal with every day, no matter what our color, our race, our nationality, our belief. Any community is seriously threatened by drugs. And so this moment, this little scene we're going to give to you, and it will also give you one of the few restorations that will surprise those of you who know the opera well. Because before the duet, Bess, You Is My Woman Now, the actual dialogue, a line sung by Porgy, followed by a spoken line by Bess, was never copied into the score, though it was in the conductor score and in George Gershwin's manuscript. And so for about 50 years, actually maybe even longer, no one's ever heard it. But it's actually what makes the duet Bess, You Is My Woman Now start. It's exactly why it starts. Otherwise, you just hear 8 bars of orchestra. Now, these 3 people will sing, and Michael will make his debut in the role of Jake from the piano. He's the only white man to sing those lines in history, and don't tell the Gershwins, because actually part of the contract is that only people of color can perform this, which George Gershwin's gift to assure that people in blackface would never ever sing this opera. So here's that scene. I'll sit and try not to conduct.
Hello, Bess. Going to picnic? No, guess I'll stay home. Picnics is all right for these small town suckers, but we is used to the high life, you know. You and me, we understand each other. I can see for the life of me what you is hanging round this place for. Why, with your looks, Bess, and your way with the boys, there's big money for you and me in New York. I can't remember ever meeting and nothing but I like listen out those you. Oh, come on now. How about a little touch of happy dust for old time's sake? Oh, throw me the stars. Come on. Give me your hand.
I tells ya, I through.
Just a pinch, not enough to hurt a flea.
No, no, oh, don't give up, don't.
Tell that to somebody else. Nobody ever gave up happy dust. Come on. Come on, Bess. Let go, you damn criminal. God, what a grip for a piece of a man.
Sport life, you keep away from my woman, or I'll break your damn neck.
I'd like to see a lousy cripple like you break my neck.
If I get my hands on you,
all right. Your men friends come and they go, but remember old Sport and Life and the happy dust here all along.
head out, you rat, you mouse, puzzle. Bess, you is my woman now. You is, and you must laugh and sing and dance for two instead of one. What, no wrinkle on your brow? Oh, because the sorrow of the past is all done. Oh, Bess, my Bess, the real happiness is just begun. In evening time, in summertime, and wintertime, Bess, you got your Bess, you is my woman now and forever. This life is just begun. Bess, we two is one. Bess, to my both women, you got your Porgy, you loves your Porgy. I've seen it in your eyes, Bess. Summertime and wintertime. This
Well, there was only space for a small selection. Isn't this when they're doing the raffle? After this. After this. Well, I guess we'll start with some questions for the singers. I'll start with a question for Bess, which is, she's such an interesting and some might call her a tempest-tossed, or some might even use the word weak-willed to describe her. So we're interested in how you find the characterization, how you...
I think Bess is a very interesting character. I saw Porgy and Bess when I was a kid, when I was in my teens, and I was just absolutely mesmerized by the music and by the story. To me, I was brought up in Europe, so to me it's not that much of a black thing. For me, it's more a love story, a love triangle. It's the story of Bess. She is just absolutely desperate to have a good life, and she really wants to. She needs a man by her side to take care of her. And in the community that she lives, she's a very outspoken character, so people don't really like her because, you know, she likes to wear short dresses, and she's a sassy girl. And in the community that she's living, they're very Christian oriented, and, you know, they don't really like that. So she's an outcast in that community. And then she always falls for the wrong men. For example, she goes first, there's Crown, who is, I'm sure that Crown is somebody who beats her up, who gives her drugs, and just makes her quiet. But of course, he's very happy to be with Bess, because actually Bess, by the men, they would love all to be with her. So he's very happy to be with her, with Bess. And then she comes suddenly to this cripple who absolutely takes her as she is. And I think she's never had that in her life. She's had quite a bad life. So that's why all of a sudden she has this man who just takes her as she is, who loves her without even asking questions. And that, of course, is something that she's never experienced, and she just falls for that. And then, unfortunately, it goes wrong again, and then she comes to this sporting life who's been wanting her, you know, since a long time. And he woes her, he gets her with the drugs. So she's a woman that is really torn between, she cannot be on her own, and that's why she's dependent on other people, and that's why she always falls right on her face.
The great thing about Morenike's Bess, though, is that she never makes her a victim.
No.
And, you know, certain people, every actress that I've worked with always do it their way, which they should, of course. That's the joy and the magic of theater and opera. Morenike always makes very, very strong choices, and if she feels that they are incorrect, she will be the first person to tell you, but she makes it work. And her Bess, even though she is sort of defined by the man that she is with,
yes,
it is her choice to be with that person,
be with them, absolutely.
which is a very, I think, an important point.
I'd like to know how recordings and performances of the past have influenced or not influenced how each of you approach your role.
I can say Porgy and Bess got me into the business. I saw the film with Dorothy Dandridge and with Sidney Poitier, and that really got me going. I want to sing that one day, because the music was just, I fell in love with the music and with the whole thing of theatre and music being brought together. And I said, that's what I want to sing one day, and I was blessed that I am allowed to sing it. And I would never forget one of my tours that I did in the earlier days. We went to Africa with this piece, to Cairo, and then we went to Egypt and Eritrea. And they had just had a 40-year civil war. They just stopped. And they just cleaned out this theatre and just let everybody come in. People from the streets were coming in as an audience. And they loved it. And it was, for me, an experience that Porgy and Bess can bring so many people together and can just fascinate. For me, that was the nicest experience I've ever had, because Africans, they don't really, opera that's not their world, but it was just the story and the music that really got them. They loved it. And you could see people with guns. I mean, it was like street people. They know nothing, and they just loved it. It was one of my nicest experiences with Porgy.
It's interesting the audience may not know that the film was not beloved at all by the Gershwin family, and it's actually very hard to see the film because it's not been put on some of the newer formats. But I too saw the film as a child, and I loved it. I loved the music, and I fell in love with Porgy and Bess, and it's one of my favorite experiences to go to the opera.
How about some of the rest of you, particularly you, Jermaine, with people like Sammy Davis Jr. and Cab Calloway as part of the legacy of your role? Did they influence you or not?
Well, my first influence came from Larry Marshall, who did the Houston production, actually. I got a call asking me to come to New York to the audition for the last leg of the Houston tour, international tour, and it was going to Paris, and I did it, and I got on. And that was my first big piece. And back then, I got into opera not because it was a passion. It's because one day I was making fun of an opera singer, and someone heard me and put me in a program. You know? I was a computer science mathematician.
It's easy as that.
You know, that's the movie fame.
Literally, I was a drummer. I was a computer science mathematics major. So I was like, singing, money? No. But so I did it for fun. I was just on summer vacation. I just went out there for fun, and I did the piece, and I just fell in love with it. And seeing Larry Marshall do it, it was phenomenal. And so that was my basis. And then as I study it more, I start to see other characters and other people who have done it. And when I got the opportunity to do my first Sport Life, it was underneath Larry Marshall. I was covering him, and so I based everything off of whatever he did. And he was staging it, and I would do something. He said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "I saw you do it." He said, "I didn't do that." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I don't know why I did that, but I shouldn't be doing it." I do something else. "Why are you doing that?" I saw you do it. When did I do that? So I started to understand that I will have to just take the time to do my own character sketch of the character. And so I'm born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm the first to graduate from college out of my family. I grew up in the ghetto, and all of my cousins were everything from the pimps, the drug dealers, to gangbangers all the way up. And so, what do you know? I'm playing it on stage, so, my mother always wanted me, I want you to succeed more than what your cousins are, and now I'm using them to have a career, and because I base Sport and Life totally off of them, because, you see the images of drug dealers and gangbangers, you see that image and you think negative. But I used to see my cousins every day when they're not in the streets, and they were some of the most funny and hilarious people, would have you just laughing, and they were characters. So, and I know them, and I see that, and then I would see the evil side of them if they was with one of their, with their prostitutes, and I've seen them, would hit them and fight women, and so when I see all of that, I bring this to the Sport Life. So, and then on top of my studies from just other roles, from your Yagos to from the Bible, from the serpent in the garden, I just weave all this in together. And so Sport Life is a character that not only is after just Bess, he's just after succeeding by any means necessary, and he will use everything he has to succeed by that. And this is my own personal character sketches that I base Sport Life being someone whose father is a pastor, and he's a PK in the black community. PK is a preacher's kid, and there's a complex about that, because if you understand being a PK, it means that
angel or devil.
Yeah, you can't do any wrong in the church. Or that's the pastor. Everything gets, everything is set aside for you. So it's like you can't do any wrong. So I base Sport Life off this character who's see church members during the week praising God, and then like, oh, this is a good Christian woman. Then during the week, I'm in my father's back office, and I'm hearing the stories they're telling my father, or confessions. I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? And I start to see this is. What I see is not so real on Sunday mornings, but the reality is duality of the people that come to church. And then I also see that
I can't do any wrong. So I can't do wrong because people say that's the pastor's son. Then I can't do wrong because, hey, you're the pastor's son. You can't do that. So I leave that whole scene to say I'm going to make it on my own, and it will not be upon because my father's a pastor. So I go to a whole new community, and that's why I enter into Catfish Row, and I'm trying to make it to New York. I'm trying to get out of this low level up to the north, you know, the highlights, the Broadway, and I can't do it by myself. So I use drugs, I use my wit, I use my means. That's why when I enter into the picnic scene, I talk about the Bible. I know the Bible. I grew up on it. And I do say in that song, if you listen, even though I'm making fun of the Bible, that to get into heaven, don't snap for a 7, live clean, and have no faults. And so I understand what it is to be a Christian, but I also understand what I have to do to succeed, and I would do that by any means. And I see it being in Bess, because she has something that makes guys go, whoa. And so I can use that, and I can prostitute her and do whatever I can to succeed. And so by any means necessary, that's why I go for Bess, and I know I can succeed with her. And so my character is based upon my livelihood, and then later I started seeing the Sammy Davis and Cap Calloway's, and I was like, oh, but that's the reality of my character.
How about you, Eric? How did you prepare, and what did you do for research to get you to Porgy?
Well, insofar as influences, I've actually never seen a complete performance of Porgy and Bess. I haven't. I remember when I was very young, I was taken to a concert version of it in Philadelphia at the old Robin Hood Dell. And I remember specifically, it ain't necessarily so more than any of it. Because I just remember the audience laughing and the Methuselah line. But that's when I was about maybe 5 or 6 years old. And growing up, I mean, I knew the hit tunes, but I had never seen the opera.
And you've come to this role late in your career.
Yeah, this is the second time I've done this. I did it for the first time last year. I mean, I've listened to some recordings, but I tried to make it my own. I mean, I think that's, if you're going to listen to a recording, listen to like tons of them, so you're not listening to one and that gets in your ear and all of a sudden you're just sort of being a parrot. I think it's what makes opera and singing in general just so unique is that you can bring your own sort of identity to it more so than a violinist can to the Brahms violin concerto. I mean, there's certain constraints. I mean, a good violinist, it's not going to sound too different from another really great violinist, but the different hues and colors of voices out there and what you can bring to a role, I think, it makes it quite interesting. Preparing for it, I read the Bose Haywood, and I know some people have made it down to Charleston. I have not. I just haven't had time. I would love to go, but yeah. I mean, if you come to see the show, and if you want a real treat, come 2 nights. Come see 2 different casts. Yeah. And it'll be a totally different experience. And it's just wonderful in that. I mean, live theater. And if you come one night and 2 nights and see the same cast, it's going to be a totally different experience. Live theater is just a wonderful thing. Unlike a movie, it's going to be the same every time. And I'm still developing and growing this role, and it's nice to get to do it a second time, so that I feel much more relaxed now, and I can try things, so hopefully it'll keep growing. But just from just experience and going to the text and being true to the music, I think and that's different to each individual person what that means. So.
And the first time Eric did it, he had literally like 5 minutes to rehearse. You know, here's your crutch, go. And so that was his background. So, I mean, he did an amazing job considering that I just kept throwing things at him and putting him in different places. So that's what's so amazing about this opera, though, is that there are so many dynamics to each character that, I mean, the three people on the stage play it completely differently than the other cast. And yet they're both spectacular. So, which is what I love about it.
You know, you can only actually illuminate some aspects of music at any time. You know, I give an upbeat and that's the tempo. That means it can't be any of the 4 million other tempos it could be. And we are all so sensitive, and I mean all of you, I don't mean us, I mean the audience, that when a tempo is slightly slower or slightly faster, partially because of the way Western music is written, which is a series of, you know, this note is half as long as this is half as long as that, this has half as long as that. So it's like a stroboscope. So if you're slightly slower, sometimes the music feels faster because you're hearing the inner beats, right? So maybe chronologically it's faster, but it's actually feels slower. Sometimes chronologically it's slower, but it feels faster. I know that's a little bit hard to understand, but again, as I say, your ear goes to certain elements. So if you're going to the long notes or the harmonies, because you're doing it faster, it'll actually seem slower. So every time you do one of these things, every one of us together creates that experience, which starts with a downbeat from me in this case, but at the end of it, which is 2 hours and 50 minutes later, that's a journey that you partake in, you see. Because that's the other part of what we're all saying. We actually react to the audience, and the audience is different every night. But if a tempo is a little faster, for example, it's a song that no one on this stage sings, which is A Red-Headed Woman, which was sung by Crown. If you sing it, a red-headed woman makes a choo-choo jump its track, which is a kind of a normal tempo. Gershwin actually writes, a red-headed woman. That point, when it's just slightly slower, it's just dirtier and down and more earthbound. And that's a very slight change in the metronome mark. I mean, the technicality is how many beats per second. And by just slowing it slightly differently, it becomes something else. Oh, there's somebody knocking at the door. It's very different from, oh, there's somebody knocking at the door. Because in the one case, you're hearing bump, 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 bump. And the other, you're hearing bump, 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 bump. And you've gone one level lower, and you're hearing the inner pulse. So all of those choices, which we do all together, make each night different and make each performances different. And the accumulation of all of those individual moments is to have the through line from the very beginning to the very end. Conductors should theoretically have the very end in mind when the opera starts, just as the composer did when usually it's a he or she, has finished the work. So that's also part of what makes the live theater experience so extraordinary.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you
I know
so much.
that we have an added bonus from Washington Opera about to happen before we have audience questions. Okay. Are we going to have
The bonus from the opera
the bonus from the opera
company?
at the end?
At
All
the
right.
end.
All right, then we'll do
Okay.
questions from the audience.
All right, yes, let's
We
invite,
have a microphone.
we're being taped, so
Yes, I'm just curious, what was the perception, actually, I wrote a couple of my questions, so I didn't want to forget them. What was the perception of the black community when both the black community and the white community, because let's face it, during the 30s, America was pretty much a segregated country. So what was the perception of Porgy and Bess when it first appeared in New York? And I may be answering my own question, but I understand that during that period, it received a rather chilly reception in New York. As you indicated earlier, Duke Ellington didn't particularly care for Porgy and Bess. The NAACP didn't particularly care for it. But I'm just curious to know, was the perception identified in the New York Times or any of the critics, did they differ based on racial lines? And the other question I have is that I think at one point, Gershwin took Porgy and Bess on the road, and it actually played here in Washington, I believe, in the 40s with Todd Duncan and Ann Brown.
1936, March 21st.
And let's face it, Washington was a segregated city back then. I mean, black people couldn't even go to department stores and try on clothes. So I presume that the National Theater was probably had a segregated policy when it comes to seating blacks and whites. So I'm just curious, what was the perception of the audience, I mean not the audience, of the individuals who were in the play when they looked out in that audience and saw a
Rita's got
That's a great question.
Rita will answer that question for you.
When I was researching Porgy and Bess, this completely floored me. It closed here at the National Theater, March 21st, 1936, and the cast went on strike and they protested, and they said that we were not going to perform unless it was an integrated audience, and the National Theater listened. Yeah. And they made the audience integrated for all the performances of Porgy and Bess, which was the first time the National Theater had ever done that, first time it had ever happened in Washington, D.C. So the fact that we're discussing this at the American History Museum is very telling to me, because that was in the 1930s, and that to me is a spark of the civil rights movement, and was amazing.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I'd like to address the first question. The second one, I think, probably was just answered. But earlier, when you mentioned that Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein were thinking of taking the play Porgy, or the book Porgy, or the play, I'm not sure which, or maybe both, to write it as a musical for Al Jolson in blackface, this whole issue is hugely complex, but remember, it was Kern and Hammerstein who actually started the whole issue of civil rights movement on the stage of Broadway in 1927 with Showboat, because they wrote a musical in which the audience, which might not have thought this way when they went into the theater, were rooting for a woman who was half black and half white thrown off that boat and who sacrifices her career for a young white woman. And you love that character. You love her, and it's a very important, very, very important show from that point of view, and that's 1927. Porgy and Bess is 1935, and that's a really powerful show, because remember, the white people, except for one character, are all seen totally as racist, as impossible bigots. And so it's a very, very strong show from that point of view. But here's the other interesting thing that you have to understand, is that an entire community of great musicians who otherwise could not perform on opera stages had their livelihood because of Porgy and Bess. And a whole community in Harlem actually grew up so that everybody, whether they were in the chorus or soloists, were understudies, and everybody learned all of the roles. And to this day, there's a huge community of African American performers who travel throughout the world, whose livelihood between other performances after Marian Anderson broke through barriers and the various African American artists who joined our opera companies, but that Porgy and Bess was a mainstay. And as far as racist comments, the most racist comment from Porgy and Bess was the review in the New York Herald Tribune, because you showed a picture of two people. Who was the white person in that picture? Do you remember? You had Duke Ellington on one side.
Oh, Virgil Thompson.
And you had Virgil Thompson. Virgil Thompson was a music critic of the I guess the New York Herald Tribune, or the Herald at that time, and he was clearly an anti-Semite because he referred to the gefilte fish orchestrations. The idea that a man could write that and not be fired shows you that it wasn't just a black and white issue, but it was also a Jewish issue, because Gershwin, as a Russian Jew, as the son of Jewish immigrants whose parents escaped the pogroms of Russia, that's part of why George felt so attracted to this story, because he knew it not as a black man, but as a man whose family was part of another history of racism that was going on. So that's the funny thing about the reviews. If Ellington felt that Gershwin was expropriating African music, that's fair enough. But I think perhaps Duke Ellington was unaware that George Gershwin actually, his family grew up, was in Harlem, and George studied with all the great jazz musicians in his part of New York City, just as he later tried to study with Ravel and, of course, studied with Schoenberg in the last years of his life, because George Gershwin was one of those composers who just wanted to learn all the time. So it's a complicated answer to your question, but it is an important one for us to think about.
I would comment to say that there were mixed reviews, but they don't necessarily break along racial lines.
Right.
That's really, there were African Americans. Langston Hughes was one of them who thought that it was a wonderful show. Langston Hughes, of course, wrote about a lot of low characters, if you've ever read his Simple Stories. So he found it he was very enthusiastic. Others who were African Americans, such as Duke Ellington, didn't particularly like it, but that has something to do also with the notion of folk. What did folk mean in the 30s? So people who were identified as folk, in fact, Porgy and Bess was often known as a folk opera at that time. Today we call it an American opera because we don't, who are the folk? We're all the folk. But at that time, the notion that there were poor, rural, uneducated people, and these people, black or white, would be the folk of America, and then more elevated people, such as composers or poets or other people, photographers, might go and expropriate elements of folk culture and then take them back, to the center of New York and make them into art, was a process that many people critiqued at that time. So what Gershwin was doing was to transform all of these various experiences that he had and created not a new art form, but a new art piece within this larger framework. But it does figure into the very, very complicated racial history of the United States. The fact, as Maestro has noted, that they insisted that there be African Americans, classically trained African Americans, to sing this role from the start was very important. The play, Porgy, which precedes the opera, was done in blackface. I mean, there are productions of it that were done in blackface that were very controversial, not a very successful play. So you are right that this figures into a very complex racial situation of the United States in the 1930s. That's one of the reasons I think it's so fascinating that you've set for this production the piece in the 50s, which is also a complicated time, but a very different time than the 1930s. And it gives a different kind of backdrop to the framework of the piece, but also makes it perhaps, I don't know if you would use this word, you said it's within our memory. In some respects, it may be more accessible to audiences of the present because the 50s is within our historical memory. And of course, there are people alive who remember the 1930s, but they're getting to be fewer of them than there used to be. So more of us have some memory or parental memory of the 50s, and that makes it a more accessible experience for us.
If I might say something about Langston Hughes here, which I think is really important. Langston Hughes, I'll go back one moment. When Kurt Weill and Lotte Lenya came to America to escape the Nazis in 1935, they got off the boat in New York, and the first thing they saw was the dress rehearsal of Porgy and Bess. Now at that point, Kurt Weill realized that America could have operas because he had written the Three Penny Opera, he had written the Mahagoni, and that was the inspiration. Ironically, in 1947, when he set the play Street Scene, which had won the Pulitzer Prize, he asked Langston Hughes to write the libretto. And that's the first time in Broadway history that a black man put words in white people's mouths. And that is really, it's like he returned the compliment of Porgy and Bess and turned it around. And so all the words sung by the white people in Street Scene, and they are Italians and Jews and Russians and all those people, that's Langston Hughes. And of course, it takes a Kurt Weill to embrace that and be colorblind about that. But also, it was Kurt Weill's love for Porgy and Bess and Langston Hughes' love for Porgy and Bess that they wrote that opera together.
More comments, more questions.
Can you talk a little about the fact that, number one, that Porgy and Bess toured Europe many, many times, and because it was such a costly production, money was always an issue. But it happened that many of the times that it toured Europe, the United States Information Agency and the U.S. Department of State underwrote the production, and as a matter of fact, I think it was President Eisenhower that used Porgy and Bess as cultural propaganda to fight the Cold War. Can anyone talk about that?
Well, don't you think that's the most amazing triumph of this opera? That it, and that jazz in general, I would say, sir, that the idea that after the war, America used jazz, and the greatest jazz artists, so Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, also made a living touring Europe, and that they chose Porgy and Bess to represent America. Ironically, in the late 50s, it became West Side Story, and which, of course, was a triumph in the Soviet Union. And they were and there were those people in Russia who thought that West Side Story, that's really great because it shows how corrupt capitalism is. And indeed, the opposite happened. That they thought, what a great country that they would put that on the stage and show that. In other words, the exact opposite happened to the people who thought it was a bad idea. I think the idea, what a brilliant idea, in fact, to have Porgy and Bess tour. And ironically, when it closed, and I mean, it also, as you say, Leontine Price had her early career. Bill Warfield, who I had the honor of working with just before he died, I got to perform with Bill. He was 80 years old. That they tried to find a sequel to Porgy and Bess, and one was written by Harold Arlen, who had taken his Broadway musical St. Louis Woman and turned it into something called the Blues Opera. And Quincy Jones, the young Quincy Jones, was the music director of that opera. And it closed in Amsterdam because it wasn't very successful. And I would give anything. I mean, when I met Quincy about a year ago, I said, see if we can ever put that together, because Harold Arlen, from George Gershwin's point of view, was, quote, the best of all of us. And how interesting that would be to find out what that was. But what a brilliant moment that we used music as what you say propaganda, but to explain to people what a great country we are. That we expose who we are and the internal struggles, but with great music. It's extraordinary.
One of the really interesting things about the Department of State programs and the USIA programs is that, this is now, we're talking post-war, during the Cold War era, post-World War II, is that many of the cultural officers from European nations asked to have jazz, in particular, to have jazz be the music that was brought. They wanted to have these musicians and this music because they saw it as so both distinctive of the United States, but also symbolic of freedom, symbolic of a way of expressing oneself in an improvisatory yet compositional way.
Versus the very dictatorial style of orchestras that are European.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And there was tremendous desire to have this music.
Sorry, Joe.
And, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Ella Fitzgerald, some people people like Maya Angelou get their start in productions like this, but people who were famous.
Maya Angelou was in that production of Porgy and Bess. She toured with it.
It's really quite a fascinating moment in American cultural history, and there are about 5 or 6 new histories about this moment, as well as a touring exhibition that was put up by USIA about jazz around the world.
And you know what? Even before the post-World War II era, the sense that jazz represented freedom and was what frightened the Nazis so much, which is part of why they outlawed it.
Yes.
Because of radio, people were able to hear jazz in Germany in the 20s. They had no idea whether the musicians were black or white. They were listening to this music and they loved it. And it terrified certain people because they thought that somehow the Germanness was going to go away. And of course, all it did was postpone it And of course, the Nazis had their own jazz band too, secretly, that they didn't want anyone to know because everybody loved the music. That's the truth.
Okay. I have a question about the film, and you alluded to it earlier, that the Gershwin family wasn't enamored. And I remember watching it on television in the late 60s, and then they took it off. And it hasn't been seen since. You can't get a copy of it in DVD or anywhere else. And has it been withdrawn? Why was it withdrawn? And could one of the panel members give a brief critique of the merits of the film?
I think the film, for its time period, was as honest as Hollywood could do with the film. It was a little overblown, it was a little over-designed, it was a little over-orchestrated.
But you know, part of the reason for that was that Reuben Mamoulian, who directed the original production of Porgy and Bess in the opera, was to direct the film, and Sam Goldwyn was to produce it. And Mamoulian wanted to film it in Charleston, did not want a fake set. And Goldwyn insisted on the fake set. The fake set was built, and something like the night before filming was to start, a mysterious fire destroyed that set. And Goldwyn was sure that Mamoulian, in his kind of Russian mafian way, had actually set the thing ablaze. And so it had to be rebuilt, and Otto Preminger, the least likely director in the world to direct a musical called Porgy and Bess, directed that picture. And I think what happened, again, it got mixed up with Ira, who loved his brother so much and felt that his brother never got the proper respect. Everyone liked George's tunes, but they didn't really respect him. When Ira won the Pulitzer Prize, because there was no Pulitzer Prize in music, they gave it to Ira, not to George and Ira. Ira accepted it, and I saw it. I mean, I knew Lenore Gershwin, the widow of Ira, and Ira put the Pulitzer Prize plaque in the bathroom, hung with the face against the wall, because he had to accept it, but he was so upset that his brother didn't get it. So part of, I think, and I can't answer this question, except my think is that Ira was against the movie because it perpetuated the idea of it being a musical, with spoken dialogue and a song, spoken dialogue, a duet. And he wanted to return to what his brother had envisioned, which is what happened with the Houston Grand Opera.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
It's
the Prince,
rights.
I think
control
they
the
own
rights.
it. It's called copyright. It's
Yes,
one of those
it's called
annoying
copyright,
things.
Yes. And so you don't see it in the new formats because the people who control the copyright would have to let it be. I would also say, though, that, and I saw the film when I was a child, and I loved it. Of course, I didn't have all of
I loved it too.
I didn't have all of the education that I have now. I just loved the music. But one of the things that I would say is that the film is made in '59. It lands in a different America. So that some of these characterizations, which were, although it may seem odd to say this, most of the very stereotypical presentations of African Americans in the 20s and 30s tended to be of rural characters. You didn't really have the same, the people that you see in Porgy and Bess had not become the kinds of stereotypes, and I'm talking now not about this opera, but about a much wider range. Today, we have a lot of stereotypes of urban ghettos. That really wasn't true in the 20s and 30s about African Americans. In 1959, that has become true. So one of the things that happens is, even though the movie does one of the things that is very similar to the opera, which is it employs all of these black actors and actresses who can't get jobs in Hollywood except to play maids and butlers and people like that. Many of these people are happy to be able to have wider, more interesting roles. But the movie does land in a time in which images of African Americans are really being challenged. They're new, different images of African Americans, and so these roles don't seem to be contemporary. They don't seem to be, they seem to be part of a past that people want to forget. So context, the historical context in which something appears, is very important. It's very difficult for us to appreciate the historical context of in the 30s, here are all of these classically trained African American singers who can't perform in opera. They can't get jobs on the opera set. They could sing these songs in concert, which is what Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson and these people do, Todd Duncan, that's what they do. But they can't get jobs at the Metropolitan or any of these other operas. So this was a tremendous opportunity for them at that time. Yet today, it's hard for us to understand that very different context. The same with 1959. It came at a different moment in the history of the country. I think this gentleman.
Yes.
I'd like to return, is this on?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to return for a minute to the discussion of post-war Europe and the popularity of this kind of music over there, and wonder whether there's any evidence of popularity for this kind of music in the Far East, in Asia, in China, or Japan, or for that matter in the Middle East. Is there evidence that this kind of music is well received in those parts of the world?
This is actually toured through Japan and through Asia a few years ago, and it was completely sold out every performance. Very, very popular. And I think, again, because it's one, the music, two, it's an American opera, and it's not something that they're used to seeing, and they loved it.
Now, of course, in the post-war era, you don't have diplomatic relations between the United States and China. So there's Taiwan, so there are diplomatic relations between Taiwan and the United States, but not China. So it doesn't actually go to China until much later. But it does, USIA and other State Department jazz programs do go to the Southeast Asia and to India and to Pakistan and to South Asia in the post-war era. And they're very popular. They're in demand all over the world. South America as well.
We have two more questioners.
I have a very quick question. Who did the vocals for the movie?
Well, Bobby McFerrin's father, Robert McFerrin, sang the role of Porgy.
Addison, who did the voice for Dorothy Dandridge.
I'm sorry?
A singer named Adele. Wasn't her name Adele?
No, that was the woman who sang Summertime.
No, that was Lily Jean Norman.
Oh, that's right, from Canada, I think. But it's Bobby McFerrin's dad was Porgy.
Was the voice.
Yeah, the voice.
Yeah, the voice.
I'm interested in your comment about what do you think your difference is to have Porgy stand up? I mean, the idea of we have different ideas about disabled people now. What does it mean to have him stand, to have it, does it change the character to have him stand, even on crutches?
As the associate director for the piece, I think it shows him as a stronger character, and not just stronger in his strength, just what he means to this community. And also, if you're setting it in the 1950s, it's a little harder to have somebody who's on a cart, where even though veterans of that time, of course, we're not seen like they are today, and we have the VFW and we have the VFA, and we have all of that. He was basically given a crutch and said, good luck, and sent on his way. But if you see our production and you see how our Porgies portray it, he's still disabled and very crippling, and you see that side of him. And what's so amazing is you have this amazingly strong actor on stage with this crutch, and suddenly these bursts of power come out when you just never expect it to. And I think when you see a person on a cart, you're waiting for those moments to happen. You're waiting because that's just, he's down and he's up, and that's just something that you know is going to happen when there's going to be a fight happening. That's when that comes out. Here's this person that even with this crutch, he can go ahead and do it. I mean, that power can come out of him at any time, but he is such a gentle soul that there are only certain times that it comes out, and it's just an image to me that is a lot stronger than having someone on a cart, especially for the 1950s.
Also, I mean, there's sort of a strength and I'm cautious about using this word, but a dignity to actually being on eye level with someone else. you're down when you're half someone's size, no matter how old you are, you end up being the mascot or the pet. And certain, people will treat you, and that's why, you see now people who make wheelchairs, they have, these devices now that can have people up at eye level. And it gives you a more of a sense of equality, of looking someone in their eyes and not just being some sort of, childlike kind of character. So, yeah.
And also it just helped the Porgy's knees.
I'm all about that too. That's nice.
Well, thank all of you for being with us tonight. You've had just a taste of what wonders await you.
Absolutely.
What you think of dessert? You have the ice cream sundae. Now the cherry on the top is what you're about to experience. Here is Joe Lebrecht, Director of Marketing.
We have some wonderful prizes to give away this evening. I have 3 CD commentaries that I have been won by Michelle Brazlowski, Richard Presence, and Paul Ruffins. I have a beautiful copy of the Star Spangled Banner, The Making of an American Icon by Smithsonian Publications for Aaron Mitchell. And the winner of the tickets to Porgy and Bess is Bonnie Nearson. Thank you very much.
She said me.